Warning: this video will have a higher than average amount of flashing colors and graphics. If you're sensitive to this sort of thing, you might want to skip forward to the second half of the video. I'll be putting this warning sign in the corner for a few seconds before each video clip so you can brace yourself. Let's look at some arcade game self-tests. Retro Game Mechanics Explained is brought to you by its YouTube members, Patreon supporters, and viewers like you. Thank you. In a couple of my previous videos about Pac-Man, I've shown this short clip of the game starting up for the first time, and there have been a handful of comments asking me what the heck is going on here. This isn't the game glitching out or anything, it's intended to look like this. In fact, it's intended to look exactly like this, and if it doesn't, there's a problem. This is one of many self-tests that we'll look at today. Essentially, this is the machine testing every single bit of memory that is included on board by writing ones and zeros everywhere and then reading them back to make sure they all work properly. If even a single bit doesn't stay a 1 when set or 0 when reset, it will be detected and reported as an error. This way, the manager of the arcade machine can quickly fix it and get it back in working order. These game machines are moneymakers after all, and if they're just giving away free games when they aren't supposed to, or if they're just flat out broken, they aren't bringing in the quarters. The reason for all of the glitchy looking graphics is because video memory itself is included in the memory tests, and the jumble of tiles on the screen is just a side effect of writing a bunch of different numbers to all of the memory locations. All of these tests are only done when the machine is booted up, which is presumably done when no players would be around to see anyway. The most common self-tests at boot are memory tests, but a lot of games will also perform ROM checksums as well, which is just another form of memory test if you think about it. While these are a quick and easy way to check for crude modifications of game code, they're also good to ensure the integrity of the ROM chips, as well as if they're even present and seated correctly on the motherboard. Other tests can include a sound test, which is usually just a sound or two that lets you confirm that the audio is present and in working order, as well as a big grid pattern like this, which helps with checking the alignment and brightness of the CRT monitor. A lot of arcade machines have some sort of switch, either in the cabinet or on the motherboard itself, that allow the manager to put the game into service mode. This mode can allow access to more tests and provides results of the tests that can stay on screen for longer than half a second. Usually, everything you see at boot is present here as well, such as the checksums and memory tests. Full-fledged sound tests are more common here, allowing for every sound effect and music track to be played back. More full-screen grids are common, as well as color bars for more involved testing and color correction. Service mode is also where the game's dip switch states are shown. This small set of switches, usually located on the motherboard, controlled game properties such as the number of lives you start with, number of points to get an extra life, game difficulty, and so on. Being a physical switch you have to flip, you wouldn't need an extra battery to save these settings. The switches were usually unlabeled though, so this was a way you could change the settings without having to find the owner's manual to tell you which switch did what. I want to analyze some of these self-tests and figure out exactly what is happening at each step. But first, it would be a good idea to be familiar with the different types of memory, at least with video memory, as it's easy to tell apart visually during all of the tests. First, we can split memory into two main categories: read-only memory and read-write memory. Read-only memory, or ROM, is self-explanatory. This memory cannot be written to. These memory chips are burned once, and so the data they have on them generally can't be changed. Yes, technically some types of ROM can be rewritten, but for our purposes now, we'll just ignore that. There are two main types of ROM found in arcade machines. The first is the program ROM. These ROM chips contain the game code, and they determine exactly how the game runs. The other type of ROM is graphics ROM, also known as character ROM or sprite ROM. These chips hold all of the graphics data used in the game, from the backgrounds, text, and sprites. Program ROM and graphics ROM are generally stored separately because while the main processor utilizes the program ROM in order to execute the game code, It's the graphics processor or video unit that requires access to the graphics ROM. These two processes are usually happening simultaneously, and having them on separate chips helps with that functionality. Also in this read-only category would be BIOS data, basic input-output systems. While the main processor in arcade machines might not have a BIOS, there are often more dedicated chips and microprocessors that might have embedded BIOS programs. The other kinds of memory can be written to, store information. The first of which is a technicality: processor registers, accumulators, index registers, stack pointers, etc. These memory locations aren't found on a memory chip, but rather inside the processor itself. Generally, there are a small number of these values when compared to how much data can be stored inside a dedicated memory chip. The rest of the writable memory here are all random access memory, or RAM. Random access meaning that there isn't much, if any, variance in access time between two locations in that memory. Here we can have audio RAM, which is memory that is dedicated to the sound system for playing sound effects and music. This can hold music data, but often that is kept in the program ROM, while audio RAM holds stuff like the length and pitch of currently playing notes. There's also video RAM, which is memory that is dedicated to the graphics system. We'll come back to that. And then there's general purpose RAM, which can be used for any other purpose, sometimes referred to as work RAM. This is where you would find all of the game variables such as timers, level numbers, entity positions, velocities, and a whole bunch of other properties. We're going to split up the video RAM even further just because it's pretty visually distinct when it comes to all of these self-tests. There's the tile RAM, also known as tile map RAM or background layer RAM, or sometimes just plain video RAM. This memory just holds the tile ID of every tile that should be visible on screen. This is usually partnered with the tile palette RAM, or tile color RAM, which defines which colors each of these tiles uses. Those palettes are derived from the values that are found in color RAM, which holds definitions for each of the colors the tiles and sprites can use. Sometimes this is stored as red, green, blue color values, but it can also be in other formats depending on the hardware. Color data is also sometimes just stored in ROM instead if the color palette of the game isn't dynamic. And finally, there's the sprite RAM, or object RAM, which holds data on every moving sprite on the screen. Unlike the tiles, which are restricted to a grid, these sprites can move anywhere on the screen, so this data usually contains X and Y position pairs, as well as a sprite tile ID and palette number, not unlike the tiles themselves. Not every arcade machine system will have all of these types of memories, and the amount of each memory can vary as well. A game that only has a single background tile layer will only need enough memory to list out all of the tiles that fit on screen, but a game that has multiple layers will need extra tile RAM, for example. And any vector-based game won't have any of these types of video RAM, but rather a different kind of video RAM meant for storing instructions for drawing all of the vectors on screen. Let's look at a bunch of examples now. First, here is Galaxian's boot-up sequence. Blink and you miss it. This one's pretty quick. The first thing that happens is actually a solid black screen, which is a memory test on the generic work RAM. There's nothing drawn to the screen yet at this point, which is why it's completely dark. Second is the memory test on the tile RAM. The most common kind of test is to write a bunch of numbers in a sequence to the entirety of memory, and then read back everything to make sure that they match what was written. In this case, the game starts with a certain tile ID, 64, and then adds 47 to the ID to find the next tile's ID, wrapping around at 256 if needed. Then it reads all of them back, making sure all of the IDs are 47 away from each other. It does this test 32 times, starting with a different initial tile ID each time. The next test is incredibly quick, and you can't even see it. After the tile RAM test, the game calculates the ROM checksums. While Galaxian has character ROM chips and program ROM chips, only the program ROM chips are checked. This is done by adding up every single byte from each of the ROM chips into one value, wrapping around at 256. If the ROM is genuine, it will always add up to the same number. The fourth test here is on the sprite RAM. A similar test to the tile RAM is done on the sprite RAM, which is what causes these graphics to flicker all over the place. Due to the pattern of numbers used for the test, the sprites always show up on this screen in this diamond shape. Then, very briefly, if all of the tests pass, the letters OK are shown on the screen along with the dip switch settings. 1 coin in the coin box will give 1 credit. The player gets an extra life at 7,000 points and starts with 3 lives. Then the screen fills with this grid pattern for a moment, just so you can quickly check the screen alignment. Then the game jumps into normal gameplay with attract mode. If any of the tests fail, the whole process starts over. This way, if there was just a fluke, it will start normally on a retry. But if there's a real problem, the tests will keep going over and over and over again. In the case of Galaxian, the manager of the machine would need to switch the game into service mode. When in service mode, the tests do not start over, and instead the game will report which chip went bad. If a ROM chip failed its checksum test, it will report bad ROM, and if any of the RAM chips failed their bit tests, it will report bad RAM. You would have to defer to the owner's manual to decode the number here, which narrows it down to which chip went bad. Here's another one. Teddy Boy Blues has a relatively long self-test on boot. Its memory tests are pretty extensive. The game seems to hang on this screen that shows IC check for a while. That's because instead of just checking if each bit in each byte in memory works correctly, requiring 8 passes, 1 for each bit, it checks if every byte in memory can properly hold every 8-bit value from 0 to 255, essentially requiring 256 passes. Eventually, the words on screen start to flash along with the background. This is the color RAM being checked for all possible values. Next, video RAM is checked very thoroughly by making sure every tile in the tile map can possibly be every tile ID. And this game has 2 background layers, so the second one is checked after the first one's done. Lastly, the scrolling behavior of the background is tested with a bit of movement, then the game starts up normally, 47 seconds after powering on. If any of the tests fail, the screen immediately shows the ID of the bad chip on the motherboard. This game's service mode doesn't have much. It just features the state of the dip switches, buttons, and a very simple music and sound test, along with a second screen with some color bars. The last game I want to show off here is Joust 2, only because it has the coolest service mode in a game I've seen. When this game starts up, the first thing that happens is a few memory tests along with a short sound test. Unlike most games that use sprite objects in conjunction with a grid-based background layer, Williams Electronics games like Joust use a gridded-out background along with a single bitmap pixel-based layer for moving objects. That's why this memory test looks a lot more like TV static than any of the other ones we've seen so far, because this is the bitmap layer being tested. This next screen is a fun visual representation of the ROM checksums being tested. The big rectangle is the motherboard, and each little rectangle is the location of a particular ROM chip on the board. Each chip will light up green when the checksum passes, and will turn red if it fails. If everything goes smoothly, the game reports all systems go, which is fun. The real fun here, though, is the service mode. There are so many in-depth tests and options here. Upon entering service mode, the ROM checksums are performed again. Then next up is the RAM tests again. However, these tests will just keep going on forever until you press the button to advance to the next screen. So if you really wanted to stress test that memory, you could leave this going for a long while. The next test is a test of the CMOS RAM. Remember everything about dip switches? This game doesn't have any, and instead saves all of its option in a special memory location here. It also stores a bunch of other stuff, including the high scores, so those can persist over a machine reset. The next screen is a simple sound test that plays each of the game's sound effects and music tracks.
Be careful, warrior.
Then there's the switch test, which lets you test each of the cabinet's input buttons and coin boxes. The next screen cycles through a bunch of solid colors. And the next screen shows a fancy grid pattern. Then another solid screen of red, green, blue, and then some color bars, all useful for diagnosing issues with the video system. And the next screen is the bookkeeping totals. The game keeps track of a bunch of statistics about how much it's played, how many coins have been fed, total number of credits, and how many minutes of gameplay have occurred. The final screen is all of the settings that take place of any dip switches. The advantage of using special battery-backed RAM for these settings is that you can be a lot more granular with the options. For example, you can start with anywhere from 1 to 99 lives. There's also a difficulty setting and an option to extend the number of letters a player can input when they achieve the highest score on the leaderboard. But my favorite parts are here at the bottom. There's an option specifically to overwrite the high scorer's name with custom text without removing the score itself, just in case someone enters something inappropriate. There's also an option to set a custom message text that appears on the title screen. You can input a full 2 lines of text and reposition it on the screen, which just seems silly, but also really cool that the option is even there.
Who will challenge me?
The last thing I want to do in this video is analyze the code for a couple of these self-tests. I'm going to go over Pac-Man and Super Pac-Man's testing functions, breaking down the assembly code. Despite being the sequel, Super Pac-Man's self-test is entirely different and much more complicated for reasons we'll see shortly. Oh, and there's not going to be any more flashing colors and graphics for the remainder of the video, so you're safe there. Let's go ahead and look at Pac-Man's code. Pac-Man uses a Zilog Z80 processor, and here's the assembly code for all of the self-tests. Z80 assembly is pretty sparse, and it takes a lot of instructions to do simple things, which is why this seems like a lot of code. It can be split up into 3 main sections: the ROM checksum tests, the RAM memory tests, which can be split into the writing phase and the reading phase, and then the clearing of all memory. Let's look at the checksum calculations first. Pac-Man uses 4 ROM chips, and each chip's checksum is calculated independently. If a chip's checksum is incorrect, the game will report which chip failed so it can be replaced. And each chip actually has 2 checksums. The even and odd bytes are summed together separately. So this code first calculates the 4 chips' even byte checksums, then their odd byte checksums. Here's some equivalent pseudocode for this big nest of loops. Being an 8-bit CPU, this innermost loop sums together each 256-byte page of ROM, or rather the 128 even or odd bytes in each page. The next inner loop advances through the 16 pages per ROM chip. This line of code here is doing what's referred to as kicking the watchdog, which is essentially just resetting an internal timer. The watchdog is a hardware mechanism that is responsible for restarting the entire system if left idle for too long, so that if the game were to ever lock up somehow, it would restart all on its own without needing someone to physically come out to turn the machine off and on again. In order for this not to happen, this particular register needs to be written to regularly, and it's done several times during all of these tests. Here is the actual comparison to confirm the checksums. The running sum total is an 8-bit value that wraps around at 0, and it should equal exactly 0 after each calculation. Generally, the last byte in each ROM chip, or the last 2 bytes, 1 even and 1 odd, is reserved to be the checksum complement, which is pre-calculated at the time the ROM is burned onto the chip. The value is chosen to be the exact value needed to make the entire sum equal 0. If any of the checksums are found not to equal 0, then execution jumps down to this small block to flag the ROM as faulty. This small block of code is responsible for advancing to the next ROM chip after each checksum. This line of code resets the coin counter state. I'm not exactly sure what it's doing here, but sure. And then this small block of code flips from checking the even bytes to the odd bytes. If all of the tests pass, then execution jumps forward to the next section. If not, then the bad chip is identified by referring to the current memory address that the test was working on. The tests are marked as failed, and at this point the RAM tests are completely skipped. There's one small caveat here that's worth pointing out. See this comparison instruction? The ROM data gets memory mapped to 0 through hex 3FFF, and this instruction is in charge of detecting when the calculation has hit the end of the ROM range. This hex 30 is referring to the upper 8 bits of the ROM address. But because this is 30 instead of 40, the fourth ROM chip is actually never checked at all. The fourth ROM chip is the one that includes this self-test routine, but I'm not sure if this was on purpose or not. The fourth ROM chip does have a checksum complement at the end of the data, but both the even and odd bytes are incorrect. So if this instruction gets changed to compare hex 40 like it should be without recalculating the proper checksum, but still taking into account the change to this instruction, the game will erroneously report that the fourth ROM chip is bad. The equivalent fix in the pseudocode would be to change this less than comparison to a less than or equal comparison. Next are the RAM tests. There are 6 tests performed, 2 on the work RAM, 2 on the video RAM, and 2 on the color RAM. This small table lists the 6 tests. The first parameter in each entry is the starting address for the test, hex 4C00 being work RAM, 4000 is video RAM, and 4400 being color RAM. The second parameter is the bit mask for each test. These 3 memory regions all used 4-bit RAM chips, so each of them needed 2 chips for a byte's worth of information. The lower 4 bits of each byte are stored on one chip, and the upper 4 bits on the other. That's why there are 6 tests here. There are 6 chips in total, and each test is dedicated to one chip. The last parameter in each entry is just how many pages of memory to test, and in our case, each chip has 4 pages worth of data, or 1024 4-bit nibbles. Before looking at the code for this one, let me explain exactly how this test works. The test is split into 2 phases: writing to the memory and filling it up with a certain pattern of values, and then reading the memory back and checking to make sure all of the values are equal to what you wrote in the first place. There's an entire philosophy around what values are the best values to write to RAM to test it for errors best, but here they went with completely random values. The problem with filling memory with random values is remembering what you wrote in the first place so that you can check it again later. And we're testing the integrity of the memory itself, so we can't store copies of all these values anywhere. So we'll use the next best thing, which is a sequence of pseudo-random values. This way, instead of having to remember which value we wrote to each location, we can just calculate what it should be on the fly. The way this was done in Pac-Man was starting the sequence with a known seed value and then multiplying and adding to that value to get the next number, essentially just like a random number generator. The starting seed can be anything. Let's just start with 200 for this example. The first number in the sequence is just the seed, bitwise ANDed with the particular bit mask used in this test. For this example, I'm going to be using the bit mask of binary 00001111. ANDing with this value of decimal 15 is equivalent to modulo 16, or dividing by 16 and taking the remainder. This gives us the first number in our sequence of 8. Each subsequent number is just the previous number plus 51, then bitwise ANDed with the bit mask again. So the next few numbers in our sequence are 11, 14, and 1. Now, every 16 numbers in the sequence, there's an additional step. After adding 51, but before applying the mask, the number is multiplied by 5, and 49 is added to it. So the 17th number in the sequence after 5 isn't 8, but rather 9. This happens again on the 33rd and 49th number, and so on. The sequence ends up being 1024 numbers long for each of the tests. Now, this isn't a very random sequence of numbers, but it doesn't have to be that random, just good enough for the memory test. And remember, this sequence is dependent only on the very first number we chose. Just by changing the seed value from 200 to, say, 201, we can end up with a different sequence of numbers. And of course, with a different bit mask, we get an entirely different set of numbers. These bit masks ensure only one RAM chip is being tested at a time, and lets the game report which one is faulty. Okay, let's take a look at the code now. This seems like a lot, but it's really not that bad. It's just a lot of math. Here's the equivalent pseudocode. The two big chunks here are the write phase and the read phase of the test. The innermost loop of each is calculating the next value in the sequence. Here's the AND instruction that applies the test's bit mask, and here's the read or write to RAM. Here's the adding 51, the multiplying by 5, and adding 49. The seed value for the first test here is hex FF, or 255. After one write phase and one read phase, the seed is reduced by hex 11, or decimal 17. This sub-instruction subtracts 16, and then the DJ and Z branch instruction decrements it by one more. 15 total passes are done, as the loop here breaks out when the seed value becomes 0. This is actually kind of frustrating to see because this convoluted sequence of numbers was actually chosen so that every 4-bit memory location gets every possible 4-bit combination written to it, while still feeling random. There are 16 possible values for a 4-bit nibble to have, but only 15 of them are tested. The missing values are exactly the values that would be present had the test been run one more time with a seed value of 0. Oh well. The biggest loop here is over the 6 entries in the test table, which in the assembly has a very crude way of checking for the last entry by comparing against the memory addressed high byte and the mask together. Finally, if there ever is a mismatch in any of the memory comparisons, the code jumps down to this small block. The chip number is derived from the bit mask itself, and the RAM is flagged as faulty. Lastly, all of memory is cleared to set up for the screen that displays the result of the tests. First, the work RAM is cleared out to all zeros. Then the video RAM is cleared out to all hex 40, which is just a completely blank tile. Then the color RAM is cleared out to all 15, which is the default blue and white color palette. I'll skip over how the test results screen is displayed because we'll look at that in the next example. Super Pac-Man's memory tests are significantly simpler, but not as robust. Additionally, the hardware in this machine is completely different. Pac-Man had its Z80 CPU, 6 ROM chips, 6 RAM chips, and an interface for all of the I/O, such as the buttons and coin boxes. On the other hand, Super Pac-Man has a pair of coprocessors. The main CPU can access video RAM, as well as 3 work RAM chips. It can also access 2 larger program ROM chips. The sub-CPU only has access to a smaller program ROM, as well as a shared RAM chip dedicated for audio. There are also 2 character ROM chips on board, one for all of the graphics for the tiles, and one for all the graphics for the moving sprites. And finally, there are 2 I/O microcontrollers that interface together with the main CPU through a smaller RAM chip. Due to the limited accessibility, both CPUs have to do their own self-checks on what they can reach. Let's look at the code now. We'll start with the main CPU, since the sub-CPU initially starts dormant and needs to be initialized by the main CPU anyway. Both co-CPUs are Motorola MC6809Es, so the assembly code here looks quite a bit different. The first thing on its checklist is to do a memory test on the 4 main RAM chips. That's done here, and here's what the pseudocode would look like for this block. Instead of using a pseudo-random sequence of numbers, like Pac-Man did, Super Pac-Man sources its number sequence by just using the ROM itself. It just grabs the first 8,000 bytes of one of the ROM chips and dumps it all into RAM, and then reads it back to make sure it matches. This is done 16 times. Each time, a different number is added to the value from ROM before writing or reading it. This way, each byte in memory gets at least 16 different values written to it. Any address that fails one of these checks gets kept track of right here. The code path here is a little weird because even if all of the tests pass, this code still runs. It's just that the chip that gets marked as the failed chip is the 5th one, which hasn't even been checked yet. It takes care of that later, though. Also, Super Pac-Man stores the chip number in terms of its graphics tile indices, where the tile that displays a 1 is tile hex 31, A tile with 2 is tile hex 32 and so on, which is where that comes from. In my pseudocode, I just keep track of the chip number itself from 0, 1, and so on. The next thing in the checklist is to wipe out all the memory that just got filled, and it does this similar to Pac-Man. Video RAM gets all hex to 0, color RAM gets all 2s, and work RAM gets zeroed out. Once that is done, the game quickly writes a few strings to the screen which serve as the template to the self-test screen. This table here has each of the strings. They start with the video RAM address to start drawing the string, followed by each character to draw in order. The strings are null terminated, and the table is as well. Here's where it checks for which RAM chip failed. If none of the chips failed, this will be reporting the 5th chip as bad, which we know can't be the case yet, so that's the cue to keep going forward. Which is the exact chip that gets tested next. This test is very similar to the first in that ROM is dumped into the RAM to fill all hex 3C0 bytes. However, these two chips are smaller, and just like in Pac-Man, one holds the upper 4 bits of each memory location, and one holds the lower 4 bits. So the main difference in the test is that when a failure is detected, the game exclusively ORs the original ROM value with the value it read back from the faulty RAM address. This results in the bits only being set where they differ. It can then determine which chip is the bad one based on which bits are flipped. Next on the checklist is the small amount of RAM in the buffer chip between the main CPU and I/O chips. This is done not unlike before, just making sure to ignore the upper 4 bits of data, since the I/O buffer chip only outputs 4 bits at each location. Up next is the ROM checksums. The main CPU can only see the 2 big ROM chips, so those are checked for here. This is pretty standard as before, just summing up all of the bytes on each chip into a single 8-bit value. Super Pac-Man stores a more proper checksum and checksum complement together in the second ROM chip. All of this code seen here is in the second ROM chip. If you add up all of the bytes in the ROM, you'll get the checksum. But if you store the checksum in the ROM itself, then now you have to account for the extra byte, which increases the checksum. To prevent this self-reference, the checksum's complement is stored next to the checksum. The complement is usually just whatever value when added to the checksum equals 0. Though Super Pac-Man uses a checksum of hex 66 and a complement of hex 28 for some reason, it still solves the self-reference problems though. A complement wasn't included for the first ROM chip because its checksum was stored on the second chip, so there's no self-reference in the first place. If either of the checksums don't add up, then a bad ROM is reported. Okay, next on the list is to start up the sub-CPU. This is done by writing to the address hex 500B here. The two processors run in parallel, which would normally make our exploration here a little more difficult, but thankfully the two processors basically wait for each other to finish here because the game wants to make sure everything is good to go before starting everything up for good. Once the main CPU fires up the sub-CPU, it essentially sticks itself in a really long loop. Right before starting the sub-CPU, it wrote the value 0 to the shared memory address hex 4040 here, which is a 16-bit write, so address hex 4041 also gets set to 0. This is the byte that the main CPU will be listening to for the sub-CPU to report its results. As long as that byte remains 0, it will hang in this loop for a while. It isn't forever though, and if time runs out, the main CPU will assume that something went wrong with the sub-CPU's program and report that the third smaller ROM chip went bad. Let's look at the sub-CPU's tests real quick. The first thing it does is test the two smaller RAM chips again. While these chips were already tested by the main CPU, these are this processor's main memory, since it can't access the larger RAM chips, so it's worth trying it again. It's also using a different ROM chip to dump data into, so it's a bit more robust too. It does make sure to skip testing the 2 bytes that the main CPU is listening for as to not ruin everything. If there is a failure, then the bad chip is determined just as before, and the result is placed into address hex 4040, which is the one that the main CPU isn't watching yet. This will hold the RAM result, but the sub-CPU will go ahead and test the ROM while it's at it. This is done just like before with a checksum, complement, and everything. This code is structured like a loop, since there's actually available hardware for the sub-CPU to have access to another ROM chip, but it wasn't necessary for Super Pac-Man, and it was easier just to reduce the loop count by 1 than to restructure the code here. If all of the tests pass, then the special number hex 4F is used as a success value. The result of this test is then written to address hex 4041, which will trigger the main CPU to continue onward with its tests. After that, the sub-CPU then goes into its own waiting loop, waiting for the main CPU to erase the result that it just wrote. Once that happens, the sub-CPU will then clear out the RAM it has access to. And finally, it will wait again for the main CPU to tell it what to do next by monitoring the value at memory address hex 40FB here. That's it for the sub-CPU, so let's jump back to the main CPU's code. After hearing the response from the sub-CPU, it will check for failures and report them if necessary. Otherwise, if both values are hex 4F, then the game continues onward with more code. These lines here write the letters OK next to the words ROM and RAM, and if there were any failures at this point, the game reports it by writing the number of the chip next to either the word ROM or RAM as necessary. The bigger RAM chips are numbered 1 through 4, the smaller shared RAM are 5 and 6, and the I/O RAM is number 7. The big ROM chips are numbered 1 and 2, and the smaller one is number 3. Now, there's actually one more test that happens, but it's a little bit later after the game sets up a lot more of the code structure for the entire game. Just like how the main CPU started up the sub-CPU, it has to start up the special I/O chips as well. It was able to test the I/O buffer RAM without any problems because those I/O chips hadn't been initialized yet. In the process of starting up the game, those chips eventually get started and start utilizing that buffer. Each one uses 16 4-bit nibbles of the buffer. They utilize it in different ways depending on what mode they're in. For example, they can monitor the player's input, listen for newly inserted coins, or output the state of the dip switches. However, when they first start up, they go into a startup mode. In this mode, the I/O chips will add up the last 7 nibbles it has access to, and then put the result in the first 2 nibbles, the upper 4 bits in the first spot and the lower 4 bits in the next spot. In Super Pac-Man, the chips will also first initialize the last 7 nibbles to all be 15. This means that the first 2 nibbles will end up being 6 and 9. 15 times 7 is 105, which in hex is 69. The main CPU can ensure the integrity of the I/O chips themselves by verifying that this sum is correct. Here's the code that does that. This is tied in with more general code since these I/O processes are run every frame during gameplay. It's just that this startup mode is only run at the very beginning, of course. The location of the I/O buffer memory to the main CPU is at hex 4800 for the first I/O chip and 4810 for the second. So this routine is run once for each chip. This bit of code just figures out which mode the I/O chip is in and runs the appropriate routine. The startup mode is mode 8. This is some more convoluted assembly math, but it's essentially taking the negative of the calculated sum in the first 2 nibbles, and then adding that back together with the final 7 nibbles. Together, it should all equal 0. If it does, there's no problem, but if it doesn't add up, then the game immediately reports the chip number on the self-test screen. I like this code because theoretically it can run at any time, so if the I/O chip found itself in the startup mode again somehow, and was also faulty, a random number 1 or 2 would show up on screen, and the game would lock up, like this. Thank you so much for watching. I want to make another huge shout out to all of my YouTube members and Patreon supporters for all of the help. Everyone scrolling by your screen right now plays a big part into making this channel possible and allows me to keep doing what I like doing. And if you're just a viewer, making it all the way to the end here also helps out a lot just due to the algorithm and everything, so special shout out to you as well. Members and patrons can also get early access to videos, as well as some behind the scenes content. Supporting either on Patreon or YouTube gets you the same stuff, so you can pick whichever one is more convenient for you if you'd like to chip in a bit. Thank you so much, and see you next time.